Chapter 13. The Dirty Dozen. In mid-2010, I would return to my battalion and be thrown into the world of logistical support as the new Company Quartermaster Sergeant, CQMS, of No. 12 Company for our next deployment to Afghanistan. This company was not a traditional infantry fighting company, as it mainly consisted of a highly experienced team of both senior, non-commissioned officers and officers. Our mission was to train and mentor the Afghan National Army, ANA, as Kandak advisory teams on Op Herrick 13. I would have a dual role in mentoring an ANA battalion, as well as providing logistical support for the men of 12 Company, who were scattered out in 6 locations in Nad Ali South in Helmand Province. During our pre-deployment training, the focus was on adapting to US protocols, and, at the time, I had no inclination of the political reasons behind this, and quite frankly, none of us really cared. At international level, the Anglo-American special relationship had been damaged when the British had withdrawn from Basra in 2007. The aftermath of this was that the US were reluctantly required to commit further troops to the Iraqi southern city. Then, to regain American favour, the British would be coerced into increasing their troop numbers in Helmand Province, not under the autonomy of British command, but rather in line with US foreign policy and under the guidelines set out within Operation Enduring Freedom. This would favour a more kinetic approach to the counterinsurgency and lack the subtlety of British strategic thinking, especially the concept of hearts and minds. However, this does not suggest that British forces did not have a coin strategy in place, as the 2006 Helmand Plan consisted of a policy of clear, hold and build, by initially securing the key towns of Lashkar Gah and Gereshk. This was not successfully implemented, due to the lack of troop numbers that were required to hold and dominate the ground, as this strategy was manpower intensive. The Helmand Plan would evolve into the Helmand Roadmap in 2007, when Brigadier Andrew Mackay highlighted that the people were the prize, not ground or attrition. Minimum force was always a priority for British military commanders, especially when fighting a guerrilla force such as the Taliban, as winning over the population was a key factor for strategic success. It is evident that under British leadership, the principles of hearts and minds and winning over the population were at the very core of all military thinking. But this would change due to international pressure from Washington. British senior commanders would come under criticism from the US because British forces were defending towns and cities from Taliban attacks, and this did not comply with the narrative of Operation Enduring Freedom. British forces were becoming fixed in defensive positions in temporary platoon houses, whilst defending the towns in the north of Helmand Province. This favoured the insurgents and left the towns and the poppy fields of Nad Ali in Taliban hands. And this is where the Irish Guards would be deployed in Op Herrick 13. The Taliban soon realised that they could not win a systematical war with the British in Helmand, and had recognised that the key principles of coin operations were vital for their own success. They understood that by forcing the British to rely on their core competencies, the high-intensity fighting in Helmand would destroy the Afghan towns and villages along with their inhabitants, thus gaining political support and favour for the Taliban. Therefore, through a combination of a severe lack of military resources and US political intervention, British forces were not able to successfully implement their planned Hearts and Minds campaign and resorted to a more kinetic approach that was primarily focused on defeating the Taliban militarily. Winning over the hearts and minds of the population was crucial for success in Helmand, and despite being part of our pre-deployment training, once we deployed, these lessons would be quickly forgotten. When we arrived in late September 2010, there had been 59 amputations and a staggering 92 deaths of British personnel already that year. Bearing these casualty rates in mind, we were all aware that British forces could not successfully adhere to a policy of minimum force, as Helmand Province had become the most dangerous combat zone in the world. I would be stationed primarily at Camp Tombstone, which was part of the ANA camp, along with the rest of the Irish Guards' logistical department. Camp Bastion was the main British Army base in Helmand, and by 2010 it was the size of Reading. Then there was Camp Leatherneck, where the Americans were based, which had its own bus network, and even an allocation of highway police who would continuously pull me over for speeding. All three of these camps were secure, and we very rarely came under indirect fire, or attack for that matter. I would be given a quick orientation tour, and my two main locations of interest were the hospital and the helipad. I understood the importance of relationship building and quickly made friends with the loaders on the helipad. I had previously been qualified to rig underslung loads for helicopters prior to my 2003 deployment in South Armagh, and was aware that all 6 of my locations in Nad Ali South would have to be resupplied by air. I had noticed that the movers at the helipad were still in the old-style combats, and their boots looked weathered, and this gave me a way in. I introduced myself as just Paul, and there was no need for formalities, with my soon-to-be new best friends. I came bearing gifts, and provided them with shiny new uniforms, boots, and expensive Gerber multi-tools, as I knew that throughout our deployment I may need a favour from them. And it didn't take long for me to call it in. I recall receiving news that some of the men in 12 Company had been in contact with the enemy and had luckily avoided taking any casualties. However, a vehicle had been damaged, and they were combat ineffective until they could receive replacement parts. The main vehicles that we were using in 2010 were the Jackal lightly armoured vehicles. These offered excellent mobility, but limited protection from small arms fire and IEDs, and one of them required 2 new wheels to be flown to Shawkat, a forward operating base, FOB, in Nad Ali South. This was also home to the 1st Battalion Royal Irish Regiment, with whom we had a friendly rivalry, as we were the only 2 Irish infantry regiments left in the British Army. Getting hold of the wheels and replacement items was the easy part, but once on the helipad, the loaders informed me that there was a 2-week backlog on the flight manifest, and that I would have to book my replacement vehicle parts through official channels. I took a quick look at the manifest and noticed there was a sortie to Shawkat that very afternoon. A plan was forming. There was already an underslung load of supplies for the Royal Irish waiting for collection on the helipad, so I asked if I could add my wheels and replacement parts, only to be informed that this was not possible, as there was a weight limit to consider. There was only one solution then. I would have to unload the Royal Irish supplies and load up the Irish Guards vehicle parts, and that is exactly what I did. This did come at a price, as for the next 6 months I had to avoid the senior logistical manager, the quartermaster, from the Royal Irish, as he was out for blood after not receiving his own supplies. This was made increasingly difficult on my frequent visits to his own FOB in Shawkat, as I was on his most wanted list. But luckily, the cat never caught the mouse. After about a month into the tour, I was required to recalibrate all of the company's electronic countermeasure equipment, and this had to be completed in person, by a 1-for-1 exchange due to the sensitive nature of the equipment. I would load as many sets as possible into my large backpack, and then fly by helicopter to the various patrol bases where my men were located, before returning to Camp Tombstone with the outdated equipment. On one such flight, the helicopter loadmaster was struggling to move my excessively heavy backpack and asked for assistance. We were travelling in a large Chinook helicopter at the time, so I unstrapped my seatbelt and made my way over to him. As I picked up the heavy backpack, we must have come under enemy fire, as the helicopter initiated some evasive manoeuvres and set off its chaff and flares. I lost my balance and attempted to steady myself, but the weight of the equipment in the backpack caused my torso to sharply jilt in a pendulum motion, but was restricted by my body armour plates just above the waist. I felt a pop in my lower back, dropped the heavy backpack, and sat back down. I was in excruciating pain. I was hurt. When we finally arrived at the patrol base, I was having cold pain sweats, and had to ask 2 private soldiers to pull me to my feet, and then to help me with my backpack. The average infantry soldier on Op Herrick regularly carried weights well in excess of 100 pounds, and this was largely from the front and back body armour plates and ammunition, which I was still carrying despite my debilitated state. I wasn't able to put on my backpack by myself, and still needed additional help from these 2 private soldiers. I then made my way to the Irish Guards location and collapsed in a heap of pain. I knew that I had seriously injured myself, but I was stuck in a patrol base in the dangerous war zone for the next few days, so I would have to man up. On return to Tombstone, I immediately sought out our battalion doctor and was referred for physiotherapy at the hospital in Bastion. I would always make the effort to visit any Irish Guardsman if they'd been unfortunate enough to have been injured, and I was a frequent visitor to the hospital. I would witness the medical staff often breaking down in tears as they were responsible for the medical care of not just the coalition soldiers in Helmand and the ANA, but also the Taliban fighters as well as the civilians who were frequently caught in the crossfire. The Taliban cared little for the safety of non-combatants, and if I'm being honest, by failing to adhere to a policy of hearts and minds, neither did we. You cannot successfully win over the political support of the local people when you are continually calling in artillery, Apache gunships, and dropping 2,000-pound bombs. The tempo of the fierce fighting would result in the emergency room being frequently inundated with complex casualties, which was a battle within itself for the medical professionals at Bastion to deal with, and at times this took its toll on the medical staff. My physiotherapist granted me 4 days of light duties and gave me some exercises to build up my core strength. When reviewing my own medical notes from Afghanistan, it is clear from my symptoms that I was suffering from a core instability that was originating from a herniated or bulging disc in my back. However, one must acknowledge that these medical personnel are soldiers first and have a chain of command to follow. As soldiers, there is always an underlying mission, and theirs was to keep as many boots on the ground as possible, and this was required to make Op Herrick a success. Let us not forget that the Army's needs are prioritised above the soldiers, and my long-term physical welfare was a gamble that the Army was willing to take to fulfil its short-term goals. Personally, I was frequently witnessing soldiers being medically evacuated with gunshot wounds and with the loss of limbs from IED blasts, and it didn't seem fair that I was complaining about a bad back. Besides, pain was weakness, so I would rely on my training and just have to get on with it. For the remainder of the tour, I would avoid, where necessary, lifting heavy items, but could not avoid carrying the excessive weight of my body armour, radio, ammunition, medical kit, and water. I would be pulled to one side and informed by a senior commander that I was setting a bad example to the junior soldiers due to my bad back. The same senior commander would also accuse John of faking a bad back to avoid aggressive patrolling when he was in fact experiencing the onset of the early stages of cancer. All the command element cared about was amputees. And if your injury was not visible, in their eyes it was non-existent, and you were classed as a malingerer and a coward. John and I were two respected, battle-hardened soldiers, and I am still saddened at how we were treated by a senior commander within our own regiment throughout Op Herrick 13. For the first time in my career, I was experiencing the unjust stigma attached with being a second-tier logistical support soldier, and would attempt to shake this off by getting out on the ground as much as possible. Despite being in severe pain the whole time, I would volunteer to replace any members of 12 Company at every available opportunity, whether through an injury to a soldier or simply recovering whilst someone was on R&R. Every time there was a casualty, whether a gunshot wound, blast injury or amputation, I would feel guilty for being in the confines of a safe location. I didn't join the infantry to provide logistical support, but my current job role was a prerequisite that all infantry soldiers were required to accomplish for further promotion, and I felt that I was unfortunate to have to fulfill this whilst on an operational deployment. In fact, throughout my whole deployment in Afghanistan, I only ever came into contact with the Taliban on one such occasion. I was covering one of the other commanders whilst he was on R&R, and I was the vehicle commander of a Jackal, which meant that I was the operator of the GMPG. We were part of an ANA convoy, and whilst we were patrolling on a narrow dirt track that was parallel to a canal, we came under small arms fire. And from the chatter on the ICOM scanner, a radio that scans the Taliban communications, the Taliban was specifically targeting our 3-vehicle convoy rather than the ANA vehicles. In an ambush situation, we had taught the ANA to keep driving through and get out of the killing zone, but for some reason they just stopped. We were now trapped in between ANA vehicles to the front and rear, on a single-vehicle track, silhouetted, with rounds ricocheting off the limited composite armour of our Jackals. I instinctively screamed, "Contact right!" But this wasn't necessary, as everyone knew where we were being shot at from, and were already engaging the firing point. Then I swung my GMPG to the right to engage, only to find that I was unable to use my favoured machine gun due to the safety limitations of the way in which the gun was vehicle-mounted. I rapidly unclipped my seat harness, whilst simultaneously grabbing my personal weapon, and began to engage the firing point. We were trapped in the killing zone of an ambush, with nowhere to go. This was surely the end, as it was a predetermined ambush, and the Taliban had the advantage. To my bemusement, the ANA soldiers had debussed from their vehicle and were casually chatting away to themselves whilst the Taliban bullets rained in around them. What seemed like a lifetime was only a few minutes, but eventually the front vehicles mounted up and slowly began to continue on the patrol, and we drove out of the killing zone to safety. It was a miracle that we didn't receive any casualties. On return to the patrol base, I joked with the drivers of the Jackals that I would be billing them for the damage to my vehicles, as bullet holes were not cheap to repair. And they didn't know if I was serious or not. By now, all of the British soldiers had been in several contacts with the Taliban, and this was just a normal day for them. So maybe, like I had felt on my previous tours, they had just become numb. What was surprising, though, was how little regard the Afghan soldiers had towards their own safety. Their culture and religious values were completely different when comparing them to the Iraqi army, let alone a Western one. Shortly after this event, and from my experience of mentoring my own Afghan logistical department, it became clear to me that our presence here was futile. We were forcing our Western culture, Western democracy, and Western values onto a people that didn't want or ask for it. We were only in Afghanistan because of 9/11 and the hunt for bin Laden. But after almost a decade of fierce fighting and the enormous loss of human life, our mission had become diluted. The British Army were now fully behind Operation Enduring Freedom, which was part of the US foreign policy and its war on terror. Therefore, and not for the first time, British soldiers would help implement the US global rhetoric. Then we must look at the strategic locations of US forces in the Middle East. American forces still continue to dominate the Middle East in 2020, with almost 70,000 soldiers stationed in Afghanistan, Iraq, Jordan, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, and Kuwait. This raises many political questions as to why the British were still in Afghanistan in 2010, as Al-Qaeda had already been defeated and bin Laden would be killed in the following May. Were we just an extension of US foreign policy? As, geographically, we had now surrounded the dangerous Islamic country of Iran. I cannot help but think that due to the vast riches that are obtained through liquid gold in the region, and the unpredictability of Iran, that the war on terror was a smokescreen for US dominance for control of the region, and to also put military pressure on the Iranian government. Looking back at my initial months in Afghanistan, I never really committed myself to the mission. I don't know whether this is because of my age and experience from previous tours, or the fact that I was not primarily deployed in a combat role and leading men. In Iraq, I had to convince myself that we were just, as if I had doubts, then my men may have had doubts, and this may have led to indecision, hesitation, and possibly the injury or death of one of us. As a battlefield commander, you have to inspire confidence in your men, and this is a prerequisite for leadership. In Afghanistan, however, I was no longer a commander, but a logistical manager, and this afforded me the luxury of a more holistic outlook. I would observe the vast amounts of heavy ammunition being used against the Taliban with no consideration given towards its destructive power and the unavoidable damage to the local population. This went against the principles of my previous 5 operational tours, where the proportionality of our weapons systems was always predetermined by the law of armed conflict. The high numbers of coalition casualties and deaths, for that matter, would also have a harmful effect on the combat soldiers on the ground. As a result of this, they would disregard the more traditional and reserved British approach to counter-insurgency operations. This would result in British forces being drawn into fighting an unwinnable, symmetrical war against a well-organised and efficient guerrilla force, as this supported the principles of Operation Enduring Freedom. Soldier G would be deployed on Op Herrick 13 as a Fire Support Group, FSG commander. His primary job was to provide heavy supporting fire in overwatch to the infantry, who were generally conducting foot patrols. At his disposal in his 4 Jackal vehicle convoy, he would have snipers, GPMGs, Browning 50 caliber heavy machine guns, 40mm grenade machine guns, GMG, and Javelin anti-tank missiles. In one single engagement, when providing fire support for a company of infantry soldiers in contact with the Taliban, Soldier G gave the orders to fire multiple Javelin missiles and almost depleted all of his GMG ammunition. Soldier G stated that this was necessary as the infantry he was overwatching had sustained several casualties in a fierce 10-minute firefight, and that he was responsible for providing sufficient covering firepower for their tactical withdrawal. This was achieved by winning the firefight, which meant using all of the overpowered and destructive weapons at his disposal. He emphasized that once he had asserted dominance and control of the battle space, the company of infantry were able to tactically withdraw, and the casualties were able to evacuate by helicopter back to Bastion. On return to their patrol base, Soldier G would be thanked by all of the junior commanders as they had been pinned down by Taliban fire in a designated killing zone. It was only because Soldier G's sole concern was the safety of his comrades that he utilized the superior weapons system of his FSG, and they were able to break free with no fatalities. However, the senior commanders were not so content and would criticize Soldier G for being far too aggressive. Soldier G was doing his job effectively with the tools and training that had been authorized for use in this operational theatre. Helmand was no longer under British stewardship, and we were becoming more in line with the US approach to counterinsurgency operations, which was directed towards defeating the Taliban militarily through dominating the ground. Quite often, and from my own experience, once the bullets and bombs start flying, the political element of the operation is no longer significant, and my only purpose at that immediate moment was the well-being and protection of my brothers. I, like Soldier G, was at times criticized for being overly aggressive. But it is through aggression that battles are won, and, in this instance, the company of infantry were able to withdraw without sustaining any further casualties. I acknowledge that at the tactical level, where the warfighting generally happens, the strategic mission is often lost. But one must understand that the junior commander is only focused on his tactical mission and may not necessarily understand or have any strategic insight into the long-term political goals. Was Soldier G in the wrong for using such devastating firepower? Absolutely not. He had used authorized weapons in the correct way and was able to win the firefight and, in doing so, saved the lives of his military brothers. He essentially did the job that he was trained to do, but this did conflict with the preferred British approach to counter-insurgency operations in winning over the hearts and minds of the population. However, we were under the US-led Operation Enduring Freedom as a consequence of our political failing in Iraq, much to the distaste of British High Command, who often tried to strategically undermine our American cousins. It is no surprise that our mission had become confused, and as a result of the intensity of the warfighting in Helmand, British forces would continue to meet aggression with increased aggression, which was detrimental to the principles of a successful counterinsurgency strategy. Trauma risk management was supposed to have been successfully implemented by 2010, and even had its own designated page in the September 2009 edition of the Op Herrick Tactical Aid Memoir. From a management overview, it states that TRIM practitioners should intervene when personnel have been involved in a near miss or have sustained serious injuries to themselves or others or witnessed trauma involving death, particularly grotesque death. Furthermore, from a management perspective, initial interventions should be made within the first 24 hours of an incident, then followed up by a 72-hour assessment before ongoing support and monitoring. From the guidelines set out in this memoir, I should have been considered for trauma management due to my near miss. Then there are the men of the infantry fighting companies to consider. They were constantly being engaged by the Taliban. According to Soldier G, not once were any of the soldiers at his patrol base offered any support under these guidelines for management of battlefield trauma. The men of No. 2 Company would have a difficult tour in patrol base Kanarnika, particularly my friend Nathan. I had recruited Nathan into the Irish Guards in 2007, whilst I was a recruiting sergeant, and he would be unfortunate to witness one of his brethren lose both legs and an arm when he stepped on a Taliban IED. Guardsman Manor would survive, but only due to the quick actions of soldiers such as Nathan, who applied immediate first aid and tourniquets. On another occasion, Nathan witnessed the Taliban using children as human shields, and these kids were regrettably killed in the crossfire by British forces. Furthermore, he would be standing next to Liam, a dog handler from the Royal Army Veterinary Corps, who was shot in the face and killed instantly by Taliban fire, despite Nathan's best attempts to apply immediate first aid. Then there were the less traumatic patrols and near misses that often took place that would eventually take their toll on Nathan's mental health. Nathan didn't receive any trim after any of these incidents, despite several members of the company being trained as trim practitioners. Nathan believes that the only person who was successfully managed for battlefield trauma was a guardsman who stowed away on a supply helicopter back to Camp Bastion. Unless you did something dramatic, then as far as the command element was concerned, you were fine. Maybe these trim practitioners should not have been aggressively patrolling with the company, as they too had become emotionally detached, and therefore not been able to identify the signs of battlefield trauma in others. After the tour, Nathan would turn to alcohol as a coping mechanism, as he would be haunted by survivor's guilt. He would relive Guardsman Manor being blown up in his nightmares. But in his dreams, Nathan would be the one to step on the IED. Survivor's guilt would gradually eat away at him from the inside, and recently he's been getting treatment from a local complex mental health team. He is aware that he will never be cured of his battlefield trauma, but at least he is now better able to manage it. Nathan would be medically discharged from the Army in 2018 due to a deteriorating spinal injury as a result of being blown up in an IED blast that overturned his jackal. He has since had multiple spinal fusions and has lost control of his bladder, which now requires a catheter. Additionally, he is also wheelchair-bound if he wants to leave the house, and is on constant morphine for pain management. Yet Nathan rarely leaves the house, as he is ashamed about his new identity, as he is a shadow of his former self, the soldier, the PTI, and the respected sergeant that he once was. What has also exacerbated his PTSD is that the Armed Forces Compensation Scheme is yet to settle his claim. This claim has been ongoing for over 3 years and has led to several suicide attempts by Nathan, as he is struggling financially due to the fact that he is not physically or mentally fit to work. This is shameful, as Joint Service Publication 770 clearly states that any ill health pension benefits that soldiers are entitled to normally should be settled no later than 6 weeks prior to their date of discharge. Yet in Nathan's circumstances, and like most spinal and musculoskeletal injuries, the aftercare and compensation for these injuries would be denied and contested for many years to come. This disloyalty by the Ministry of Defence would exacerbate Nathan's PTSD, and he now feels abandoned and rejected by the very society that sent him to Afghanistan. Survivor's guilt was a frequent occurrence, and can make returning home feel abnormal, with many soldiers preferring to be redeployed on operations, rather than facing their battlefield trauma. There are guidelines to prevent back-to-back tours, but these can be superseded by the soldiers signing individual waivers. Frank was one such soldier, as he had to sign a waiver to deploy to Op Herrick 13, as he would deploy to Afghanistan 3 times in a 4-year period. Some soldiers have said that they preferred the tempo of life of operations to the pressures of civilian life, which is something that may be linked to institutionalization and may have a similarity to career criminals and their preference for prison life. Maybe Frank enjoyed being deployed on operations as this kept his mind solely focused on the mission. Or maybe, like myself years earlier, he believed and accepted that he deserved to die on the battlefield. Only he will truly know why he opted to continually be deployed. Due to spending the majority of my time on Op Herrick 13 in the confines of safe camps and patrol bases, I would experience a different type of battlefield trauma, almost secondary. Initially, I would be upset at seeing one of the men I knew from 10 Platoon being medically evacuated on the same flight to the UK that I was on for my R&R. Banner had suffered severe blast injuries, but at least he had all of his limbs. He'd been very lucky to have stepped on a partially detonated IED, which had fortunately only shattered the bones in his lower leg and ankle. After my R&R, I was devastated to hear that he had chosen to have his leg amputated to prevent infection and get rid of the pain. The leg was damaged beyond repair, and it was a tough decision, but the right one. I don't know if I would have had the courage to make such a decision, and this is testament to Banner's courage. Then, weeks later, another member of 10 Platoon, Spike, was blown up by another IED. Spike was even luckier than Banner, and should have died as a large piece of shrapnel forced its way under his jawline, through his teeth, and wedged itself into the side of his skull. I remember visiting him at the hospital in Camp Bastion before he was about to have surgery to have the shrapnel removed. Spike was conscious, but off his head on painkillers, and seeing him like this completely devastated me. This was the first high-intensity deployment when I wasn't emotionally numb as a result of my combat support role. I no longer had the mindset of those soldiers out on the ground who were constantly witnessing their brothers being injured, disfigured, or killed. I was acting like any rational human being would in seeing his mates injured. Maybe this was a consequence of spending the previous 2 years in a civilian work environment in the careers office, or maybe my 6 operational tours had taken their toll on me. But seeing the young men of 10 Platoon, my family, being injured, broke me. Then things would go from bad to worse. John had been ambushed by the Taliban by a multi-weapon shoot, including a medium machine gun, whilst on a foot patrol around patrol base Hazarat in the November, in which Guardsman Davis was killed in action and pretty much everyone else in that section was shot or wounded, including some of my good friends. In the months afterwards, John was an empty vessel, and he often linked the stress of being in that ambush to triggering his cancer. John was never the same again, and he would only ever speak about this traumatic incident when blind drunk. However, we'd been fortunate, as the battalion had only suffered 1 fatality at the hands of the Taliban throughout Op Herrick 13. Then, on their very last patrol before returning home, Major Collins and Lance Sergeant Bergen were killed by an IED on their way back to Camp Bastion. Soldier G recalls listening to the incident over the radio and instantly gathered his men to deploy for immediate support, only to be told to stand down and return to base, as they had died instantly in the explosion. He was helpless, and there was nothing he could have done to save them. And like many soldiers of my generation, he feels guilty for not being able to have done more. I recall being in a happy mood as more of my comrades were filtering through Camp Bastion and Tombstone, and that we had all switched off as we were preparing to return home, Our time in Afghanistan had come to an end. We were all summoned to the cookhouse and were sharing war stories, and were in high spirits when we were informed of this saddening news. This was a 9/11 moment for the Irish Guards, as these were two very popular soldiers. Perhaps it was because it was their last patrol that it hit everyone so hard. The atmosphere within the room quickly changed to anger and rage, with tables and chairs being thrown. Some soldiers had tears in their eyes, whereas others were screaming and punching walls. This was the final nail in my emotional coffin. I was done. My second-tier logistical role had opened my eyes to the true cost and futility of warfare, and thankfully, this would be my last operational deployment. Our decompression was sombre due to the recent deaths of our two brothers, and I do not recall too many soldiers getting totally wasted on beer or even fighting with each other. It was better organised, with decent entertainment such as live bands and comedians. But this was not a party or fun atmosphere. It felt more like a wake. Yet again, there was nothing in place for confidential mental health support. Sure, we could all talk to the Padre, and this was the preferred approach. But the death of these two soldiers had rocked the whole battalion, and it was blatantly obvious that we were all collectively suffering, and, like always, we would have to man up. Reflecting back on my time in Afghanistan, I genuinely believe that our presence there was a complete waste of time. This was a different kind of warfare than what we had previously experienced in Northern Ireland, Iraq, and Kosovo, and we were always destined to fail. This was a result of the lack of consideration that was given to the social, religious, and tribal elements of the Afghan culture, and the simple fact that there was no coherent long-term strategy in place. Then there is the political dimension of the damaged Anglo-American special relationship to consider, as British politicians foresaw Helmand as an opportunity to redeem their lost prestige over our withdrawal from Basra. As a consequence, the US coerced us to support Operation Enduring Freedom, which focused on a policy that prioritized combat operations and, as a result, abandoned the British policy of minimum force and hearts and minds. This not only went against the ISAF mission, but established the conditions for the Taliban to win over the political dimension of the Afghan people. Then, there are the 454 British deaths to consider, as well as all of the life-changing injuries. And let us not forget the hidden wounds as a result of the darker side of warfare. Afghanistan opened my eyes to the futility of war. And this was because I was not war-fighting or responsible for men in battle. I was able to see it for what it actually was: political failure. Our only presence in Afghanistan was an extension of US foreign policy, which saw the Irish Guards arguably experience more intense firefights than they had witnessed in the 2003 war in Iraq. However, the only positive I can take from our military failure in Afghanistan was for that over a decade we kept the fundamental extremist fixed in this region. But we did also provide them with invaluable lessons in warfighting, which they would utilize in future terror attacks on the West, such as the Charlie Hebdo incident in Paris in the January of 2015. I still feel that we were politically abandoned by the British government throughout my 2 tours of Iraq. But in Afghanistan, we militarily defeated ourselves by adopting the US policy of militarily overpowering the Taliban on the battlefield. Counterinsurgency warfare is not a new concept, and it saddens me that the vital lessons from previous conflicts were not consistently applied in Afghanistan. My experience and lasting memories of Op Herrick 13 are, unfortunately, bitter and full of regret. And, like many soldiers of my generation, our experiences of warfighting, especially the darker side of warfare, would take its toll on our mental health. An invisible burden that would stay with us for the rest of our lives.